are you prepared to tell us the nature of the clearance you gave to your officials?
I am not prepared to add anything to the account that the Prime Minister has given to the House with regard to these matters.
Very interesting. May I ask you this? Were you interviewed by Sir Robert Armstrong in the course of the leak inquiry?
I do not propose to go into the conduct of the leak inquiry.
Did you discuss with your staff the likely course and/or actual course of the leak inquiry?
Same answer.
Obliged. Why was the Solicitor General not told that his letter was going to be leaked?
Same answer.
That was the House of Commons Defence Committee failing to get answers from former Industry Secretary Leon Brittan about the Westland affair. But at least Leon Brittan turned up. 5 civil servants at the heart of the Westland affair were prevented by the government from giving evidence at all. The Defence Committee failed to get answers. The Trade and Industry Committee failed to get answers. MPs on the floor of the Commons and the press have failed to get answers. All that was more than a year ago, and it's tempting to let the matter rest. There's no shortage of people who'd like the questions to go away. But the questions won't go away because they're of fundamental importance to the way Britain is governed. They're about telling the truth to Parliament, the involvement of civil servants in party politics, and the independence of government law officers. These questions are as relevant today as when they remained unanswered a year ago. So it was in an attempt to get answers that World in Action embarked on an unusual journalistic exercise.
We asked a group of the country's most respected political journalists to undertake a special task for World in Action. During the Westland crisis, their coverage kept the British public informed about many of the extraordinary events taking place behind closed doors in Downing Street, Whitehall and the City. For this programme, they've gone back to their contacts to try to discover exactly what took place in the political battle over Westland. 9 journalists cross-checked information and pooled their knowledge to provide a script for this reconstruction. The exercise produced remarkable new information about the Westland story. We use actors to help us to understand events. They do not attempt to impersonate the politicians and civil servants, but simply to represent the positions we believe were adopted by them. Not all the journalists know about every incident, and few of the words spoken are precise history. But our experienced political commentators are satisfied that what follows is a fair reflection of the Westland story. By the autumn of 1985, Britain's only helicopter company, Westland, was in serious financial difficulties. The company had negotiated a rescue package with the American Sikorsky Company in association with Fiat of Italy. Trade and Industry Secretary Leon Brittan had told Westland that the government would not give them further financial help. But Defence Secretary Michael Heseltine was in favour of more cooperation in defence matters with Europe and wanted Westland to join forces with other European companies rather than with the Americans. Heseltine had negotiated an agreement with the national armaments directors of Germany, France and Italy. If approved by governments, the plan would mean they would only buy helicopters of 3 main types from European-owned companies. His plan would virtually exclude Westland from selling helicopters in Europe if they allowed the Americans to take a stake in their company. The plan came up for discussion at a meeting of the Cabinet Economic Affairs Committee on December the 9th, 1985.
Well, we come once again to the matter of the European National Armaments Director's proposal over Westlands. I remind you that our policy is that the company should have a free choice in this matter, without outside pressure on them. And therefore I have said that we should reject the proposal. We've tried and failed to get agreement on this twice before, so I want a firm decision today. The Westland Company are very alarmed by the plan, so I have invited the chairman, my friend Sir John Cockney, to tell you why.
Sir John Cockney's presence at a cabinet committee was an indication of the close relationship he enjoyed with Number 10, which was to play an important part in the unfolding events.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Well, few of you realise, I think, that Westland's financial position at the moment is dangerously weak. With a loss of £96 million about to be announced in 10 days' time, we're on the point of bankruptcy. The American Sikorsky Company with Fiat are making the only offer of help which could be in place within that timescale. And the effect of this recommendation by the European National Armaments Directors is to undermine their offer, so that there is, in my view, a very real danger that it may be withdrawn. Now, at the same time, we've spoken on several occasions with the so-called European Consortium, and I'm bound to say we have no clear idea of what they propose. Indeed, so concerned are we about the uncertainty of their approach that we would only be prepared to consider it if the government is prepared to underwrite it in full.
But if I may say so, Prime Minister, Sir John, you have yourself highlighted the shortcomings of your own argument. You wish to reject the European offer when you have no precise idea of what the European offer is. And what I am saying is that the very least we can do is give the Europeans a few days to get their proposal together so that the Westerns can consider it alongside the existing proposal.
After an hour and a half of sometimes heated discussion, Sir John Cockney was asked to leave, and the arguments continued for a further hour and a half.
Now, I'm afraid the urgency of this, both for Westlands and ourselves, means we cannot keep putting it off. We've discussed this matter twice already, and we really must resolve it this afternoon. Industry Secretary.
Trade and Industry Secretary Leon Britton had earlier seemed to prefer a European solution to Westland's problems, but now said he wanted to leave the matter entirely to the company's board.
Well, thank you, Prime Minister. I agree completely with Sir John that the protectionist policy proposed by the European armaments directors is not in the best interests of Westlands, or indeed of British industry as a whole. We have heard this afternoon that it alarms Westlands, and it is also bound to alarm American industry in general, which is likely to feel that there is something anti-American in all this, and is likely to retaliate, which could have very serious wider consequences for our industry.
And I must warn
The discussion continued. Heseltine warned colleagues that the American Sikorsky Company only wanted to build their Black Hawk helicopter at Westland to put pressure on the British government to buy it.
the very least we should do is give the Europeans a few days so they have a proper chance to get the proposals to the company. Now, that must be in the interest of everyone, and most of all the Western shareholders.
The party chairman, Norman Tebbit, whom the Prime Minister normally felt she could rely on, surprised some colleagues by taking Heseltine's side.
I'm afraid, Prime Minister, that it seems to me that the Defence Secretary has a point. After all the work that he's done in this area, it would seem not unreasonable that the Europeans should be given a few days to put their case.
But look, the company wants and needs a decision from us. If we cannot agree among ourselves here today, we are going to have to meet on Friday at 3 p.m. after the stock exchange closes, when we'll settle it once and for all.
Civil servants noted the reference to a further meeting which they would have to arrange if today's meeting failed to agree. Heseltine felt he was winning over the cabinet and regarded a further meeting as his chance to go around the Prime Minister and put detailed proposals from the Europeans before ministers.
But we want Westlands to have a choice, not to make up their minds in the half-Nelson which the Defence Secretary is seeking to put them in.
Well, no one would dispute that, but perhaps the Industry Secretary could tell us how they could have a choice if we don't give our European partners a chance to put their case. All we're asking for is a few days.
Well, clearly, despite all my efforts, we are not going to agree this today. My feeling from the meeting is that we should give the Europeans until the end of the week to come up with a firm proposal which the Westland Board can recommend to its shareholders, and that we will allow the Armaments Directors' plan to stand until then.
Mrs. Thatcher believed that her summary had made any further meeting to discuss the matter unnecessary. But Heseltine still thought he'd get another chance to put his case to ministers.
Where do we go?
The 4-day deadline meant that Heseltine had to work fast. He and David Horn of Lloyd's Merchant Bank, which was advising the European group, worked round the clock to put together a rescue package. The task was made more difficult because Westland refused to supply information to which David Horn believed he was entitled. But within 2 days, it became clear that the further meeting, which Heseltine believed had been promised for Friday, would not take place. When ministers gathered for the Thursday cabinet meeting, Heseltine was angry.
I want it placed in the Cabinet minutes that a meeting planned for tomorrow has been cancelled.
I beg your pardon, but the Defence Secretary is mistaken. No such meeting for Friday was agreed to, and since no meeting was agreed to, there is no meeting to cancel.
But, Prime Minister, I'm afraid that plainly cannot be right. Because your own civil servants were in the throes of setting up such a meeting following your remarks to the Economic Affairs Committee. It was being set up and then it was cancelled.
If civil servants have been arranging such a meeting, they had no authority to do so. The Economic Subcommittee laid down a clear policy which made any further meeting unnecessary.
I'm sorry, Prime Minister, but I'm afraid that isn't right. I've been asked to get together the European option and given a deadline to do so. And in such circumstances, it is only right that colleagues have a chance to examine it.
But I have repeatedly said that it is for the company, not the government, to decide which option it shall choose. And that is exactly what it will do on Friday.
Well, I protest at this most vigorously. That plainly cannot be right, no, because...
Heseltine later took up the matter with the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Robert Armstrong, but his protest made no difference. The incident reinforced Heseltine's growing belief that he may be forced to resign over the Westland issue. He informed the government chief whip and his own permanent secretary of the possibility. So, had the Prime Minister quashed the discussion, or hadn't she? It was an important question about her style of government. Her account to Parliament later was unequivocal.
No decision to hold such a meeting was taken or recorded. No meeting was agreed. There was no meeting to cancel.
Certainly, ministers, and certainly ones who were not partisan, had a meeting penciled in their diaries, and they have told me so. So in their belief, there was at least an assumption at the end of the meeting on the Monday that there was going to be a meeting on the Friday.
Why would she cancel that meeting?
I think why is because she didn't want to have rehash the arguments over again. She realised that Michael Heseltine had some support. And also she did feel, well, look, we've given him a chance to get the European consortium off. It can't do it. Why should we bother to have another meeting?
But the European consortium did get its proposal together, and it was delivered to Westland's London office before the deadline expired. It was rejected by the Westland board, but the Europeans decided to fight on and put their case direct to the company's shareholders. And in the Commons, the opposition was beginning to exploit the increasingly public divide in the government.
Surely the Secretary of State is not seeking to pretend that there have not been fundamental disagreements going right to the heart of government policy between him and his colleague, the Secretary of State for Defence, which have been advertised in the extraordinary public wrangling of recent days.
On the right honourable gentleman's first point, I assure him that my statement was made on behalf of the government as a whole.
Beside Leon Britton on the front bench, however, Heseltine's expression left observers in no doubt that he disagreed. Now concerned that he was being outmanoeuvred, Heseltine stepped up his public campaign, appealing directly to MPs by giving evidence to the Defence Committee and by briefing the newspapers.
I think from the moment when it began to go public in the press, when it was clear that Michael Heseltine was going to stand or fall on this one, when the scale of the leaks became really of a wholly different order from those that journalists are fairly used to, cabinet ministers ringing up journalists, reading over cabinet minutes. I think at that stage you realized that something seismic was happening, quite out of proportion to the issue involved. This is rather a small company, Westland. No one could quite believe that people could get so worked up about it.
On the same day that Heseltine was trying to win over the Defence Committee, Mrs. Thatcher called a meeting of close advisers.
Now, I have called you together because Michael's single-handed campaign has reached the stage where it is threatening not just the Americans' rescue of Westlands, but the unity of the government as a whole. He is refusing to abide by the normal conventions of cabinet responsibility, and it is time to act.
I agree. It's intolerable. He's flagrantly breaching agreements reached by government, and doing so publicly. He's trying to talk the Defence Committee into his policy at this very moment.
The Deputy Prime Minister, Willie Whitelaw, was also exasperated by Heseltine's behaviour.
I agree, Margaret. I have never seen anything like the way he's behaving. Where would it all end? Wouldn't it be a good idea if you simply confronted him, told him to observe cabinet responsibility, or else?
Oh, no, it wouldn't do any good. I've asked Sir Robert to draft a letter which we might send him, bringing him into line.
The group worked for 2 hours. They produced 3 drafts of a letter to Heseltine, each one stronger than the last. Towards the end of the session, they were joined by Mrs. Thatcher's press secretary and close confidant, Bernard Ingham. Ingham took pride in running a well-coordinated policy on government information, so Heseltine's campaign was deeply irritating.
I agree that Heseltine is completely beyond control. He's become the wedgie Ben of this government. But he's just hot-headed enough to blow his top over this and resign. He said as much to 1 or 2 people already. Do you really want him outside the cabinet, on the backbenches attacking the government?
Leon Britton was angry that Ingham, a civil servant, should interfere in a political matter and still wanted to send the letter. But the hours of discussion had been wasted. Mrs. Thatcher took Ingham's advice. The letter was never sent.
I think Mrs. Thatcher at that stage, Sir Robert Armstrong, the Cabinet Secretary, Leon Britton, all thought that they were facing, really, the end of civilised life in government because of the way Heseltine was behaving. Heseltine felt, on the other hand, that here he was, battling away for what he thought was the best interest of Britain, and he was being shut up by an imperious Prime Minister.
But Heseltine did not shut up, and at Westland's London headquarters, the public battle was causing alarm. Chairman Sir John Cuckney decided to write to Mrs. Thatcher, seeking clarification of the government's policy. Would Westlands really be jeopardising its markets in Europe if it did a deal with the Americans? Mrs. Thatcher planned to reply that Westlands would continue to be regarded as British even if the Americans took a stake in it. She chose not to mention the damage such a deal might do to European sales. But Heseltine argued that her reply must include serious warnings about the consequences for Westland of doing a deal with the Americans. He failed to persuade Mrs. Thatcher to include his warnings in her letter. Then he produced a masterstroke.
This is so clear that I have this afternoon consulted the Solicitor General, Sir Patrick Mayhew, and he confirms that this letter that you plan to send is materially misleading. He's drafted an additional paragraph which he wants inserted into your letter. It warns the company of these European reservations. Very good. Goodbye.
No politician could afford to ignore the law officers, and Mrs. Thatcher was forced to include a word of warning to Westland. But Heseltine was not finished. He'd failed to get all his detailed warnings included in Mrs. Thatcher's letter. His next move began a weekend which was to cause the biggest crisis for Mrs. Thatcher's government since the Falklands. Michael Heseltine told David Horne of Lloyd's Bank to write to him asking a number of questions about the consequences for Westland of going ahead with a deal with the Americans.
David, Michael Heseltine.
Horne's letter was sent at midday, and Heseltine's reply came within an hour. He included in it all the warnings Mrs. Thatcher had excluded from her own letter 4 days earlier. Heseltine hadn't checked it with Downing Street, the Industry Department or the law officers. The letters between Horne and Heseltine were drawn to Mrs. Thatcher's attention that same afternoon. She was incandescent with rage. She told her officials to contact Leon Britton.
Have you seen these letters? Yes. The letters from David Horne to Heseltine and his reply. The PM wants you to call the Solicitor General, Sir Patrick Mayhew. Ask him if he's cleared Heseltine's letter and sound him out about his view of it. Yes. Get back to us with the answer.
Leon Britton couldn't contact Mayhew until the next day, by which time the Heseltine letter to Horne had been published in the Times.
Paddy? Leon Britton. Have you seen the Times? I gather Heseltine didn't check with you before sending the letter. It's clearly a breach of what we have agreed collectively. On the basis of the documents we've got, Heseltine seems to have gone way over the top. I've had Downing Street on. The PM wants her opinion.
On the basis of the documents he'd seen, the Solicitor General, Sir Patrick Mayhew, thought that Heseltine's letter might overstate the European position. The Prime Minister was informed of his opinion. Later that day, Mrs. Thatcher asked Mayhew to write a letter of warning to Heseltine. This was the letter which was later to be leaked. That Saturday evening, the Solicitor General also did something Number 10 hadn't asked him to do.
Heseltine.
Michael, Paddy Mayhew. I've had it drawn to my attention that this exchange of letters that you've had with Lloyd's, it seems to me that you might have overstated the reservations the Europeans have about Westland doing a deal with the Americans.
That's okay, Paddy. Everything I've said I can back up. I've got more papers in the office to prove it. I'll get them round to you on Monday.
In the meantime, Number 10 has been on. I've been asked to write to you on Monday so that all this is put clearly on the record.
That's okay, Paddy. Thanks for letting me know. Good night.
I think what is very clear is that from that Saturday morning, when Leon Britton spoke to Paddy Mayhew, when Mayhew subsequently spoke to Heseltine on the Saturday night, until the great leak itself on Monday afternoon, there was no doubt about how it was going to end up. It was going to become public, and Number 10 was at the centre of that operation throughout the weekend. There is no question about that.
At lunchtime the following day, there was a meeting at Chequers. It involved Mrs. Thatcher, Deputy Leader Willie Whitelaw, and Chief Whip John Wakeham. Patience was running out, and the exchange of letters published in the Times was the last straw.
You know, Michael is running circles round Leon in this Westland business. What on earth are we going to do to prop poor Leon up?
Well, I don't know. It's frightful, this exchange of letters in the Times. Michael seems to have taken leave of his senses. I've never seen anything like it in my life.
Yes, but don't worry about the letters. We got Leon to talk to Paddy Mayhew. We know that he thinks that Michael has gone too far. We'll deal with Michael.
But the Chief Whip, John Wakeham, was worried. Heseltine had spoken to him about Westland every single day but one over the whole of the Christmas holidays. Wakeham had been left in no doubt that Heseltine was close to resignation.
Well, the trouble is, I think, that if we push Heseltine too far, he may go. He says he doesn't mind standing by collective responsibility when there's been proper discussion, but he claims he hasn't been allowed to put his case to the Cabinet. He could obviously cause a lot of trouble if he wanted to. He's already been working hard on the back benches, for a change.
It's not clear what strategy emerged from this meeting, and the Chief Whip, John Wakeham, had to leave early to attend a play in which his children were appearing. That same Sunday afternoon, a senior civil servant at Leon Britton's department telephoned Sir John Cuckney of Westland. Cuckney was holding a board meeting that evening which would discuss whether to recommend the American deal to shareholders. He therefore needed to know that Heseltine's warnings might be exaggerated.
Sir John, we've had the letter looked at by the Solicitor General, Sir Patrick Mayhew, and he says that from what he can see, it misrepresents the position. That's helpful? Yes, we'll be making sure this gets into the press.
This call to Sir John Cuckney indicates that the decision had already been made on that Sunday to leak the law officer's opinion about Heseltine to the press. Sir John Cuckney then gave the information to a reporter on the Financial Times. This was the first leak of the Solicitor General's opinion to a newspaper. But the Financial Times was more concerned with another aspect of the Westland story. That Sunday evening, the Westland board met at their lawyer's office. The Solicitor General's opinion about Heseltine's letter was of so little commercial importance that it wasn't even mentioned. The board agreed to recommend the Sikorsky deal to the shareholders. A press conference would be held the following afternoon to announce the decision. But Mayhew's opinion was of interest to another meeting going on that Sunday night. Britton met his civil servants and political advisers at his London flat. Everyone now knew that the Solicitor General's opinion would be damaging to Michael Heseltine. But none realised that they were on the eve of a day which would cost Leon Britton his job and bring Mrs. Thatcher herself to the brink of resignation. By the following morning, the atmosphere in the Department of Trade had completely changed. Civil servants felt that the gloves were off in the battle over Westland. By lunchtime, a group of senior civil servants were waiting to see the letter which the Solicitor General was expected to write to Michael Heseltine. Britain's principal private secretary, John Mogg, had alerted the department's chief information officer, Colette Bow, who just returned from holiday. The report of the House of Commons Defence Committee, published 6 months later, said, "The fact that she was alerted to the receipt of the letter suggests that before consulting the Secretary of State and before speaking to Number 10, the officials had in mind some public use of the information contained in the letter." Mayhew's letter arrived just after 1 o'clock. John Mogg immediately telephoned Mrs. Thatcher's private office, but couldn't get through. He then called Leon Britton, who was lunching at Morgan Grenfell, the merchant bank advising the Sikorsky Fiat consortium.
Hello, this is the Department of Trade and Industry. Could I speak to my Secretary of State, please?
The political journalists working for World in Action have checked and compared information from their own sources. Their account of the conversations which follow contrasts strongly with the versions later given to Parliament.
Yes, he says that Heseltine's letter may contain material inaccuracies, and he advises Heseltine to write to Horn again to put them right.
Very good. That's more or less what he told me on Saturday. Excellent. Has Number 10 seen it?
I don't know. I tried to call the private office, but the line's engaged. This must get out, mustn't it?
Yes, but it has to come from Number 10. They asked for the thing on Saturday. I can give my authority, but I have to stress that this must be cleared with Number 10 before it goes out.
Right. Now, the contents can be put out in general terms, but what about this phrase, material inaccuracies? Should that be quoted?
Yes. I think it would be most helpful if the specific phrase comes out. That will make the point. But be sure to check with number 10.
Mogg then telephoned Mrs. Thatcher's private office at number 10 again. This time he got through and spoke to her private secretary, Charles Pole.
You've seen the letter from Mayhew to Heseltine?
Yes, we've seen it. Bernard's seen it too.
Britton says he wants it put out as soon as possible, but he wants clearance from number 10. He also thinks that since the letter was asked for by number 10, it would be better if it was put out from your office.
I'm sure we won't want to put it out from here, but Bernard had better deal with that. If your Secretary of State wants it done, I suggest you get on with it.
It's very important to understand how Whitehall operates, because a minister uses his private office, in the Prime Minister's case, her private office, as the sort of central nervous system through which all decisions are communicated, through which all information is gathered, and through which orders are issued. And if you are in the private office of any minister in the cabinet or below the cabinet in Whitehall, and you get a call from Mr. Charles Pole in the Prime Minister's office at the very gates of the presidential palace itself, that's an order from the Prime Minister. If Mr. John Mogg in Lane Britton's private office talks to Mr. Charles Pole in Mrs. Thatcher's private office, that is Lane Britton talking to Mrs. Thatcher. That is the way life is in Whitehall.
So the DTI would carry out the leak. The next question was how. Leon Britton's head of information was a high-flying career civil servant, Colette Bow. Miss Bow was immediately aware of the risks involved in leaking the Solicitor General's letter to the press. Concerned about the ethics and the legality of the act, she tried to contact her permanent secretary, Sir Brian Hayes, for advice, but he was away.
There is a very, very strong convention among ministers and even more perhaps among civil servants about the confidentiality of any advice that comes from the law officers. And Colette, for instance, would certainly have been very, very well aware of this convention. And perhaps that's one of the major reasons why she was unhappy about what was going on.
Colette Bow's opposite number at 10 Downing Street was Bernard Ingham. The conversation which followed was to cause bitterness and distrust between the two offices for weeks to come. According to information gathered by our journalists, Miss Bow had refused to leak the letter when the two spoke.
Colette, I gather you're not happy about the Mayhew letter. Now, what exactly is the problem?
Frankly, Bernard, I'm not happy at all. This isn't just any old letter we're going to give to the press. It's the Solicitor General's letter. It's a law officer's letter.
Look, calm down, Colette. Britain's authorising it, isn't he?
Yes, but...
Well, get the damn thing out. If Britain's agreed to it, you've got nothing to worry about.
But Leon's insisting that we get permission from number 10 first, and what's more, he thinks number 10 ought to be doing it, and not us. After all, it is a law officer's letter, and the Prime Minister's the only one who can authorise the whole thing. The other point is, it's your letter in the first place.
There's no need for us to be involved. You're the sponsoring department. Your Secretary of State authorised it. Now, how are you thinking of doing it?
Well, I'll give it to one of the lobby hacks. That way it's a lot harder to trace. It's the safest way to do it.
Well, there's this 4 o'clock press conference. The best way to get it out fast is to ring Chris Moncrief at the Press Association.
The Defence Committee was told that 2 identical misunderstandings had taken place in 2 separate telephone conversations between officials. Department of Trade civil servants believed they were asking for permission from number 10 for the leak and receiving it. Number 10 officials didn't think they were being asked for permission, but only to confirm that there was no objection to the leak.
When the conversation took place between Mr. Mogg and Mr. Pole from the DTI to Downing Street, between Colette Bow and Bernard Ingham from the DTI to Downing Street, I think both sides knew precisely what was meant. They knew perfectly well what the consequences of the action would be, and I don't think there is any doubt in anyone's mind who's even remotely involved in the incident that Downing Street said, go ahead, we know what's happening. And the idea afterwards that Downing Street had somehow got caught up in a strange plan of which they knew nothing and were horrified when they saw the papers next morning is frankly rubbish, and no one in Whitehall would even give it a moment's thought.
The Defence Committee's report, 6 months later, was laden with irony. It is not impossible that 4 extremely able officials in key positions would have been capable of identical misunderstandings of this sort in 2 separate telephone conversations, but it is far more likely that Mr. Ingham realised very well that what was being sought was not agreement but authority for disclosure, and this he refused to countenance. Colette Bow then phoned Chris Moncrief, political editor at the Press Association. She read brief extracts of Patrick Mayhew's letter to him. The most damaging phrase, material inaccuracies, had already been highlighted by the time she saw the letter. Only the parts of the letter which did most damage to Michael Heseltine were given to the Press Association. Important paragraphs which diluted the criticism were not passed on. Though Mrs. Thatcher was inside Downing Street for the whole period, she later told MPs that she was never consulted about the leak of the Solicitor General's letter.
Yes.
But Westland chairman Sir John Cuckney was told about the letter the same afternoon, shortly before he was due to hold a press conference. The Prime Minister later told MPs that this imminent press conference was the reason why civil servants took the hasty decision to leak to the Press Association.
Moreover, it was urgent that it should become public knowledge before 4 p.m. that afternoon, the 6th of January. Sir John Cuckney was due to hold a press conference to announce the Westland Board's recommendation to shareholders of a revised proposal from the United Technologies Corporation Fiat Consortium.
But the commercial significance of the letter was so slight that Sir John Cuckney didn't even mention it at the press conference. It was only raised by a journalist at question time.
The key decision, which was announced at the press conference, has already emerged the previous evening, the Sunday evening, when the Westland Board met, which was that it was carrying on with the Sikorsky Fiat option, and it was a mere confirmation at the press conference that afternoon. So there's absolutely no reason at all to hurry out the disclosure ahead of the press conference, given that the key decision had already been announced.
So the suggestion that this was an important thing to do because of commercial considerations is not justified?
It seems entirely spurious, and did so at the time.
The Defence Committee concluded that, since the information was passed by telephone to Westland in any event, the reason given by the Prime Minister for releasing the information to the Press Association begins to look flimsy, to say the least. The political purpose of the leak was not lost on the newspapers. Heseltine told my Lord Chief, "Stick to the facts," said the Times. "You liar," screamed the Sun, and later apologised and paid damages to Michael Heseltine for doing so. According to Mrs. Thatcher's later account, the banner headlines on Tuesday morning gave rise to only a brief conversation in Number 10.
This leak of the Solicitor General's letter to the press, do we know anything about it?
Well, there were some conversations about the letter between the DTI and ourselves yesterday lunchtime, Prime Minister.
But the leak didn't come from here.
Not from Number 10, no, Prime Minister.
Very good.
Though the leak dominated the news that day and following days, MPs were asked to believe that Mrs. Thatcher inquired no further. But fresh inquiries by our journalists suggest that she did know something of Leon Britton's role. One day after the leak, a message originating from Downing Street reached Leon Britton. It told him that Mrs. Thatcher knew what he had done and was delighted with the results. Though the leak was causing controversy all round, Britton was told that he'd earned his Prime Minister's approval. His civil servants were concerned that they might be about to take the blame for a flagrant breach of the strict rules on the confidentiality of law officers' advice. They were relieved by what Leon Britton had to say.
Excellent. The Prime Minister knows what happened and is very pleased. Everything's going to be all right.
The existence of these conversations calls into question Mrs. Thatcher's statement to the House of Commons a fortnight later.
I was also told in general terms that there had been contacts between my office and the Department of Trade and Industry. I did not know about the then Secretary of State for Trade and Industry's own role in the matter of the disclosure until the inquiry had reported.
She must have known the role of Leon Britton in not only the general but the reasonably specific sense. She, I'm sure, may be correct in saying, I did not know precisely who said what to whom and when. I didn't really need to ask. I knew the outcome of this particular ploy. I knew what happened. I was quite pleased with it, she might have added. But the fact of the matter was that she could get away with the weasel words. I did not know precisely what happened. It was almost a meaningless statement, and I don't think it conveyed much conviction.
The Defence Committee also found Mrs. Thatcher's claim that no one told her what had happened difficult to accept. It reported, "We asked Sir Robert about this, and he thought it strange, but I believe it to be the case. The Secretary of the Cabinet's description of this as strange is something of an understatement." Sir Robert Armstrong told the Defence Committee that it was strange that no one had told Mrs. Thatcher what had happened. But he could have told her himself, because the Permanent Secretary of the DTI, Sir Brian Hayes, was angry that his civil servants had been used in a political wrangle. He immediately went to tell Armstrong what had happened.
Right, Brian. Robert, it's good of you to see me, but I'm sure you know why I'm here. My civil...
From that moment, only one day after the leak, Sir Robert knew about the involvement of Leon Brittan. Though he saw the Prime Minister every day, he failed, according to Mrs. Thatcher, to give her this critical information for another 2 weeks. Neither the news media nor most ministers expected anything remarkable to happen at that Thursday cabinet meeting. Heseltine thought the crisis had passed and didn't even expect Westland to be raised. But Leon Brittan opened a discussion about Westland with a detailed summary of events so far. Then Mrs. Thatcher picked up the issue of cabinet unity.
Well, this continued refusal in some quarters to abide by the rules of collective responsibility means that we have decided to take action. The time has come to draw a line. This continued open disagreement within the government is doing damage to our wider policies and giving ammunition to our opponents in Parliament and the press.
Well, no one would disagree with that, and I completely accept that it is a matter for the shareholders to decide, which they will only be able to do if they have the full information. This is why it is necessary that I continue to give relevant information about Ministry of Defence requirements.
Well, I'm sorry that the Defence Secretary continues to take this inflexible position. Therefore, it is our decision that from today, all statements on the matter of Westland issued by any one of us must be cleared before they are issued by the Cabinet Office. Now, is that clear, Defence Secretary?
Well, it is, of course, very clear, and I am, of course, willing to accept that all new statements should be cleared in this way.
Heseltine had sensed a trap and thought he'd evaded it with his qualified agreement. Business moved on, and the matter might have rested, but the question was asked whether the new rule about clearing comments on Westland would apply only to new statements or also to statements repeating information already given.
Well, of course it applies to all statements, whether new or not.
I had not understood that, and that puts me in an impossible situation. I have made various statements about my department's views, and if I were unable to endorse them or give further information on them, it would do immeasurable damage to the interests of the European consortium. I am willing to undertake to make no new statements on the matter of Westlands, but I must be free to answer questions which are put directly to me.
With Heseltine clearly on the very edge of resignation, party chairman Norman Tebbit tried to bring him back from the brink.
I must say, Prime Minister, that one has some sympathy for the Defence Secretary's position. But after all, if I may say so, he's only being asked to do what every one of the rest of us is being asked to do, and that is to abide with collective cabinet responsibility.
I'm always prepared to accept collective responsibility when there has been collective decision-making, which has not been the case here.
No, I am sorry. The decision must stand that all future statements on the Westland affair must be cleared by the Cabinet Office. Now, I'm asking everyone round the table to agree to that.
Very well. I can't accept that. I must therefore leave.
No one in Cabinet was certain of Heseltine's intentions, and newsmen in the street were the first to know.
I have resigned from the Cabinet, and I will make a full statement later today.
Inside the Cabinet, ministers moved on to discuss foreign affairs, while someone was sent to discover Heseltine's intentions. He returned to tell Sir Robert Armstrong that Heseltine was talking to newsmen in the street. The policeman on the door had heard him say he'd resigned.
We'll adjourn for 15 minutes.
Within a few minutes, Scottish Secretary George Younger had been appointed Defence Secretary with effect from 6 o'clock that evening.
Mr. Heseltine, Rodney Carlton, The Times. Can I ask you whether you feel you were set up?
It's a good question. And I think that's quite a good answer.
think he may have been set up. He certainly had no intention of resigning at that cabinet that morning. He told his friends, and it said that he told his wife the night before, that the danger of his resigning was now much less than it had been a few days earlier. And in fact, he didn't really expect anything to happen at that cabinet. So he was taken aback by the little scheme which they'd cooked up for him. And as we know, he blew his top and stormed out. Whether they really intended that to happen, who shall say? But they must have known that they were pushing him either to a position where he would have to, in effect, abandon his policy, or a position where he would have no option but to resign.
Meanwhile, the row over the leaked letter was continuing. The Attorney General, Sir Michael Havers, was outraged at what he believed was the abuse of the government's law officers and consulted the Director of Public Prosecutions about bringing legal action. Havers had twice spoken to the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Robert Armstrong, about the need for an inquiry. Having failed to get agreement, he called on him.
I have to tell you that the Solicitor General and I are both very angry and concerned about this blatant breach of all accepted procedure on the confidentiality of legal advice. There must be a formal inquiry to get to the bottom of it.
Well, you know these things take a good deal of time and fuss and create all sorts of problems. Don't you think that it'd be much better to let the whole thing die out on its own?
That is not my view of it at all. This government has been more assiduous in prosecuting leakers than any in history. Ponting and Tisdall were prosecuted for much less than this. We cannot be seen to be condoning a leak just because some people might like the results of it.
Yes, but the feeling is very much against that, Sir Michael. And you'll be doing the government no good at all if you stir this thing up.
Look, Sir Robert, the government's legal department is not going to put up with it. If no inquiry is set up, Patrick Mayhew will resign. And even that won't be the end of the matter, because I shall have Commander Hobbs of New Scotland Yard in Downing Street by 10 o'clock tomorrow, and Commander Blake in the DTI by 10 o'clock tomorrow.
You can't be serious.
I've never been more serious in my life.
The Cabinet Secretary was so amazed that he telephoned Mrs. Thatcher's private secretary, Nigel Wicks, to come in to witness Havers' remarks. An inquiry was agreed to.
So, Brian, have you anything you want to...
During the next week, Sir Robert Armstrong interviewed the civil servants directly involved in the leak. Within 3 days, political journalists knew about Leon Britton's part in the story, but according to Mrs. Thatcher's account later, no one told her for another week. She eventually received the full report on Tuesday the 21st of January, and on the following morning there was an uncomfortable meeting between Mrs. Thatcher, Sir Robert Armstrong and Leon Britton.
Well, Leon, we have a very difficult problem here. We've got Sir Robert's report on the leak of the Solicitor General's letter. It seems that civil servants in your office have told him that you gave your authority for this leak, and that it was on your authority that it was carried out.
Well, Margaret, I think there must be some misunderstanding here. I did tell John Mogg that he had my authority to give parts of it to the press, but only on condition that it was checked with you. He checked with your office and got the go-ahead.
Yes, that's what your civil servants told me. The problem is the civil servants at number 10 said they were not asked for authority. They were told that you had given your authority for the leak, and so it was on your authority that it was carried out.
Well, the difficulty is how this is going to be presented to the House and the press. I shall have to make a statement tomorrow. Sir Robert.
The group then worked on a statement to the House. Armstrong was in favour of a carefully drafted but bland and general account of events. For the first time, Leon Britton sensed the danger of being made to take the whole blame for the leak, and the possibility of resignation loomed. He was adamant that he and his department were not going to take all the blame. The whole truth should be told.
I must insist, Margaret, that you tell the House that you also wanted the information made public, and that my officials asked your office both whether the leak should be made and how it should be made, and that both matters were agreed between the two offices.
Sir Robert?
Well, if you insist, perhaps we could say that it was accepted by both sides that the DTI should disclose the facts, and that it should be made by telephone to the Press Association.
Now alarmed by the turn of events, Leon Britton checked with his civil servants that they had obtained authority from number 10 for the leak of the letter. He was assured that the permission received from number 10 had been clear and unambiguous. For much of that day, there were meetings to draft Mrs. Thatcher's speech to the Commons. Her colleagues argued that important principles of government should be upheld.
Well, I can see there are difficulties, but my concern is the integrity of the Law Office. We cannot permit a situation in which it seems that HMG is condoning leaks or going soft on those that carry them out. So I must insist that you emphasize in your speech that had you been asked about a proposal to leak the letter, you would have said that another way must be found.
And as far as my own civil servants in the DTI are concerned, we are not prepared to accept that full blame for the disclosure should be attributed to my office. My people are adamant that authority came from number 10. And I cannot stand by and allow them to take full blame.
I'm afraid, Margaret, that difficult though it may be, there is no alternative here to a full statement of the truth. It must be the whole truth. There is, in the long run, no other way.
You do realize, Prime Minister, the Speaker will be forced to adjourn the House in the middle of your speech.
Why do you say that?
Because there will be uproar on all sides of the House.
Do you really think so, Willie?
No, no, no. The Prime Minister will be heard in silent respect. But I shouldn't be at all surprised if there are calls for a ministerial resignation over all this.
Leon Britton arrived late and felt he was being put under pressure to shoulder all the blame for the leak. He refused and continued to insist that the involvement of Mrs. Thatcher's office in the leak should be admitted in her statement to the House.
He made it clear that, subject to the agreement of my office, he was giving authority for the disclosure to be made from the Department of Trade and Industry if it was not made from 10 Downing Street. He expressed no view as to the form in which the disclosure should be made.
I think the shattering thing about the Westland affair was that for the first time, many people simply couldn't believe what she said, even when she said it so emphatically. I think that the precise words she used, which were chosen and written for her with very great care, were technically accurate. I don't think they conveyed in any sense the flavour of what had been going on in Downing Street, and I think the House of Commons knew that.
Leon Britton's stand was to cost him dear. Mrs. Thatcher's speech had brought calls for his resignation, and political journalists inquired whether he still had the PM's support.
I think there were some people in Downing Street who, when asked if the Prime Minister had full confidence in Leon Britton, gave replies which were carefully ambiguous and from which the inevitable conclusions were drawn.
But it really was rather distressing, I remember, in those last few days as to how the pack was baying for his blood. And there were, I regret to say, a good few unpleasant anti-Semitic remarks flying around at the same time. It was thought that Leon Britton had behaved badly and was refusing to take responsibility like a man and was endangering the position of the Prime Minister.
At his office that Friday morning, Leon Britton took advice from close colleagues. While civil servants said he should stay, his political friends felt he should go. He told them that he felt he'd been made a scapegoat and that others should go with him. His decision to resign gave Parliament and the press the blood it wanted, but left Mrs. Thatcher to face the Commons alone at an emergency debate on Westland the following Monday. At Chequers that Sunday, Mrs. Thatcher told close friends that she was worried. Leon had been very difficult and might be again. She was feeling close to the edge. That day, at a private house in London, junior ministers met to discuss contingency plans should Mrs. Thatcher have to resign next day. No event, including the Falklands War, had brought her closer to resignation. As she made her last-minute preparations for the debate, her closest advisers had never seen her so downcast.
By 6 o'clock tonight, I may no longer be Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, would you like to say something to us?
What are your thoughts now, Prime Minister?
In the emergency debate that day, the issues of truth, accountability, independence of law officers and civil servants raised by the Westland affair were swamped under a tidal wave of rhetoric.
We want only the one version that will be believed. That is the truth, the whole truth, and absolutely nothing but the truth.
This debate is part of a massive diversionary tactic by the opposition. They would like first to divert public attention from the growing extremism of their own party.
I believe that what the Prime Minister has said today brings the politics of this matter to an end, and that any questions...
We shall gather with renewed strength to extend freedom and ownership, to give power back to the people, and to keep our country strong and secure.
When the cheering subsided, Parliament tried to find out what had really happened. The Defence Committee failed to get evidence from the Prime Minister or the civil servants most directly involved. Its damning conclusions were published on the day after the royal wedding. The government responded by forbidding civil servants from giving evidence to Parliament on any matter not approved by their minister. The Westland Company went ahead with the American deal and is making the Sikorsky Black Hawk helicopter at Yeovil. So far, they haven't sold one.